My name is Elizabeth Karcher. I am the Executive Director of the Woodrow Wilson House, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Tuesday speaker series. Some news at the Wilson House. The building is opened this week. We're replastering some of the walls, which many of you who have been to the house have seen. We had some damage to the walls, and that's being taken care of this week. So that's really exciting for us to be back in the house and doing some work there. If you are interested in getting out and stretching your legs, we always have our walking tours available. So either Kalorama walking tour or the Waddy Butler Wood walking tour. You can log online to get tickets for those. So today we are going to have our Tuesday speaker series. This will continue through the spring. This event is part of the Wilson House Tuesday Speaker Series, which we'll be holding on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. We'll be having notable historians, curators, and leaders explore the social movements of the early 20th century and their relevance today. So today's we'll have talks about women's suffrage, activism, protests, racial inequality, inequity, and the consequences of the legacy of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The Wilson House Tuesday Speaker Series is brought to you through generous donations from Carrie Fuller, Nancy Bliss, Edward Gerber, and Christopher Keller. So you can always watch the 2020 Speaker Series on the Wilson House YouTube channel, which is available. You can get there through our webpage. And so today's speakers series, we're going to explore the day before Woodrow Wilson was sworn in as president in 1913. He was met by a modern suffrage parade organized by the young Quaker Alice Paul. Women's suffrage had gone on outside to the streets, with the result that Wilson was the first president to face the Votes for Women movement day in and day out for years. To talk about arc of the modern 20th century suffrage movement, we have Jamie Stiehm. Jamie is a columnist for Creators Syndicate. She's also a public speaker on American history, giving 3 talks that aired on C-SPAN. She previously worked as a reporter for the Baltimore Sun and The Hill. Her op-eds and columns have appeared in newspapers across the nation, including The Post, the New York Times, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. She graduated from Swarthmore and then from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she did her master's, and she hails from Santa Monica, California, and Madison, Wisconsin. Today's talk will be moderated by Lucy Lang. Lucy Lang is a candidate for Manhattan DA in the June 2021 primary. She is a nationally recognized criminal justice reform leader and most recently served as the director of Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College, a leading criminal justice think tank, where she worked with communities and progressive DAs across the country. Prior to that, she was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where she prosecuted homicide and domestic violence cases and served as special counsel for policy and projects. In that role, Lucy created a first of its kind semester-long college in prison course, bringing together assistant district attorneys and incarcerated students to study criminal justice side by side inside New York State prisons. So with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker and our moderator. Welcome.
Delighted to be with you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sarah, for your organization. And thank you so much to the whole Woodrow Wilson community for turning out in droves to hear from a great expert on this subject, Jamie Stiehm. I'm honored to just be part of helping shepherd the conversation and invite all of you to put respectful questions into the chat box, and I will integrate them into the conversation as we go along. And you can certainly feel free as we near the end to add those in as well, and we'll make sure that we hit all of them. But Jamie, I want to start by asking you to kind of set the scene by telling listeners a bit about why you felt that it was so important to have this conversation for the Wilson House community specifically in these early days of our new administration.
Well, because when Wilson was beginning his career as president, he faced the first mass movement in American history. As he arrived in Union Station, Lucy, he left Princeton He was really the quintessential Princeton man, singing Tiger songs with students there on his way to Washington. As he arrived, he noticed, he couldn't help but see that gleaming, beautiful Union Station was about, was empty. It was glaringly silent. Where were all his supporters? He wanted to know. And the answer was, they're all at the suffrage parade, sir. Meaning that Alice Paul had timed her hello to Woodrow Wilson for the day before, the eve of his inauguration, and she organized thousands of women from all over the country to march on the streets of Pennsylvania Avenue to demonstrate that they were there to claim their rights as citizens. They weren't asking for the vote anymore. They were there to take it.
And why now? Why have this conversation today instead of in December or instead of next June?
Well, the Woodrow Wilson House was gracious enough to invite us for, right on the cusp of President Biden's inauguration, sort of to emphasize that we're at a new beginning. We've recovered, we're not recovered yet, but we are healing from a very long 4 years when a lot of people were denied their citizens' human rights. And that it's a new day. Remember, 1913 was still the very early 20th century. And these women, thousands of them from places like Bryn Mawr, Swarthmore, Mount Holyoke, Smith, they were really the first generation of women to be college educated and to feel that they could no longer be second-class citizens, and they were there to make a public demonstration of that in sisterhood.
So before we delve into what happened on that day and beyond, in our conversations about this history, Jamie, you have offered some new insight to me about kind of the gendered use of language in conversations around the history. So I was hoping you could start by setting some definitions for listeners, including suffrage, activist, advocate, and other terms that will be helpful as we move forward in the conversation.
I'd be glad to, Lucy. When you look up Alice Paul, Lucretia Mott, the beginning and end of the suffrage arc, you often see them defined as activists. That is a term that historians use to diminish women and to kind of say, you were such a nice little activist, so outspoken. Please pour me a cup of tea. It's a very sort of diminishing way to speak of their achievements. And what I suggest instead, and this comes from my mother, is that they be referred to as champions of suffrage, major figures, not in American women's history, but in American history, period. You see, leaders, they were not just activists, believe me. They went through the gauntlet of, being confronted by mobs, being beaten by policemen. They went through a lot of what we saw here in Washington just a couple of weeks ago.
So let's paint the picture of March 3rd, 1913. What were these champions up to while President Wilson pulled into an empty Union Station?
Yes, if you just set the scene of this Daniel Burnham masterpiece, Union Station, with this gleaming arches, the Capitol and the White House are not very far away. You can see them. So between the Capitol and the White House, the street was completely filled up by horses, women marching, by state delegation. It was getting more and more kind of chaotic because the women were being beaten by the police who were there supposedly to guard them. And so Alice Paul knew this was happening. She had rounded up most of these women from a little office, Susan B. Anthony's old office in Washington, by telegram, by word of mouth, by letter. And she knew that the situation was very volatile, but she felt that even though there's a lot of injured women, that the parade had to go on. And one woman there, Inez Mulholland, was a labor lawyer on a beautiful white horse, and she looked like a Greek goddess. So Alice Paul was really the first modern leader to pay attention to the visual impact of a political demonstration, as well as the message that it would send.
So I think many of us can probably picture Inez Milholland on that horse, the iconic image from that march. Can you give us some more images and iconography about what was happening in the streets and how it was that Paul and others were managing to kind of galvanize the forces to do this?
Well, we're in unknown territory, right? Lucy, this has never happened before on this scale ever in American history. So Paul was at one end. I think she was near the Capitol, but she didn't know what was happening on the other end. So the women had to display, a lot of resilience and presence of mind to keep their cohesion in, the face of the beatings that they were facing. And they did. The march went on, much like, the congressional count of the Electoral College went on until the wee hours of the night until it was done.
So,
and that was an incredible way to greet a president. That was not ladylike at all. These women were, stepping out of their place. And Woodrow Wilson, as our audience knows, he was very much a antebellum Southerner. He was born in Virginia in 1856. So he was really a 19th century, persona. And Alice Paul, who was half his age, was a 20th century woman. She was 28, he was 56. And the only thing they had in common was they both had PhDs.
So thinking about these kind of different backgrounds that the two of them had as they came head to head, as it were, on that day, can you talk a little bit about the underlying philosophical underpinnings of the suffrage movement at that time? What was Paul calling on to inspire the work that she was undertaking?
That's a good question. Basically, Alice Paul was stepping in and giving fresh blood to a languishing movement. Susan B. Anthony was like 60 years older than she was, and the movement had lost its leadership, had lost its way, was divided. And Alice Paul saw that it was going nowhere. And she also learned from living in London and learning from the London suffragettes that there was a whole new way of doing business, that the suffragette movement had sort of reached the end of having conventions in Cleveland or Kansas, and the indoor phase of just meeting with each other was basically just, it had run out of steam. What she did is she took the movement from the indoors to the outdoors. She also took it to Washington, to the president. She wasn't asking governors or state houses to, support women's suffrage. She was going to one individual who happened to be who didn't just happen to be the president. Whoever the president was going to be her focal point.
And Allison in the audience asks about what were the arguments against women voting at this time. It seems so obvious to us now that voting is essential, and it seems profoundly crazy to deny women the right to vote. But what was the rationale behind the movement in opposition?
Oh, well, it's kind of a litany, but in 1848 was the first women's rights convention, and suffrage was one of the demands. And that it took 72 years to get from 1848 to 1920. There's just tremendous resistance by men to having their wives and sisters and daughters participate in the political square. And men were the ones who had to, they were the ones who got to vote and decide on whether women could vote. So it took a very long time just to overcome those barriers. And what Alice Paul did, and the genius that she was, she made it very personal. When men saw that women out on Pennsylvania Avenue were being brutalized by police, some of them were in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, and they asked, do you really have to lock up my daughter? Do you really have to, arrest my wife, force feed my mother? It was, she closed in on the sort of individual resistance to women's rights, and she made it personal, not only, for the women out on the streets, but for their families. And that public support and sympathy for the suffrage movement grew and grew over the years. And by the way, sometimes the Smithsonian is often called militant. She was not militant. Why was she not militant? Alice Paul was a birthright Quaker. Quakers believe in nonviolent resistance. They invented nonviolent resistance, and they were not they did not use violent tactics. They used creative strategies to challenge power and the status quo.
Now, we know that there are important intersections between the suffrage movement and abolition movement, but of course that the legacy of American racism was deeply intertwined into the suffrage movement as well. Can you speak a little bit about the relationship between those things and how racism and racial injustice were part of the movement or peripheral to it?
Yes and no. They were allies. Frederick Douglass was a women's rights man. Lucretia Mott, the great abolitionist, was the founder of the women's rights movement. So there were great friendships and sympathy between those working to free enslaved people and to win women's citizenship. I think that what you're saying is a little bit overblown. It's kind of an intellectual fashion that doesn't apply at all to Lucretia Mott or to Alice Paul, who are both Quakers, who were that was the first religion to oppose slavery. And so I don't accept that completely. I don't really accept that from my read of the Quakers, who were the champions of women's suffrage and some of abolition as well. Those two movements are like sister and brother. And Alice Paul, when she won the 19th Amendment for votes for women, that was for all women. That was not for white women only. The reason that women of color in the South were denied voting rights is because of Jim Crow, not because of the women's suffrage movement.
Right. I have seen some scholars suggest that in the 1913 march and again in 1914 in New York City, that Black suffragists were encouraged to march at the back of the march. Is that consistent with your understanding of the history?
I can't speak to New York, but I know that Washington, where I am right now, is a Southern city. It was a Jim Crow city, I'm sorry to say. And so the police chief, whom Alice Paul was negotiating with to march on Pennsylvania Avenue for the first time, there was kind of a back of the bus, back of the march rule that was not exactly followed in real time when it came to the march. A great journalist named Ida Wells Barnett, who's ran an anti-lynching newspaper. She arrived from Illinois and she marched with her Illinois delegation, not at the back. So Alice Paul had some political reality on the ground to deal with. But she herself was, was not happy about that.
Right. And so can you describe a little bit about how her views may have been distinct from other suffragists of the same time period, and then how they were part of this movement towards the next iteration of the women's movement?
Yes, she, as I said, she was a modern. Her vanguard looked different, dressed different, acted different than the old guard. And the old guard was a state by state strategy. And she was completely at odds with that wing by inventing the federal strategy. And she was not even on speaking terms with that wing of the party. And they were more guilty of what you mentioned just before about kind of segregating their the movement.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't just invent this for herself and for 1913. She invented the blueprint for the March on Washington 50 years later in 1963, which was a nonviolent mass movement aimed at the president of the United States, who was John F. Kennedy, where Martin Luther King gave his wonderful speech, memorable, unforgettable, I Have a Dream. She was not an orator. She was not a speaker. She was a strategist. That was her talent.
And Marcia in the audience wants to know what the reaction of Wilson and Washington to the pre-inauguration demonstration.
Well, his Secretary of State incoming had to call out the cavalry to get the march under control. So I think Wilson must have been absolutely amazed at the spectacle, but he missed, the main march because he was coming in to the train station. He didn't actually witness the march himself, but he saw the fallout.
Was Paul in the public spotlight prior to this march, and what was she like as a public figure?
No, the answer is no. She was actually quite a private person. She didn't seek, press conferences, and she organized very much behind the scenes. She let other people like Inez Milholland be the face of the parade. But Alice Paul was a very serious, bold, daring individual. And when she went to London after graduating from Swarthmore, she actually went out to the streets with the London suffragettes, the Pankhurst family, and all their other women who really were ahead of the American movement. And she learned by getting arrested with them. She learned their techniques. She learned how to confront authority. She was force-fed in jail. So she took the British model. In London, they were suffragettes. In Washington, they were suffragists. She took the suffragettes home across the Atlantic, and that's how she completely revolutionized the suffragist movement.
Is that terminology distinction intentional, and if so, why?
Well, the American suffragists didn't want the word to have a feminine twist. Of all the words not to be feminized, that I actually prefer suffragette myself, which the British use, but they also embraced the term women's suffrage, WOMAN. They were very kind of severe and stark in their language. And their dress was often white, as you know, with purple and gold. They were really the first political movement to have such a public presence.
Right. So I want to rewind a little pre-Paul and talk a bit about Lucretia Mott, from whom she drew great inspiration. And if you could describe what Mott did to lay the groundwork for the 1913 march, and then how her philosophy and approach was distinct from the early 20th century suffragists.
Sure. Lucretia Mott was also a birthright Quaker. She was born in Nantucket Island, which was a Quaker community at the time. She felt very deeply against slavery. She lived in a seafaring community, so she understood the Middle Passage and its cruelties. So slavery was her first cause, but as she grew older, she made women's rights her sister cause. And for her, living in Philadelphia as the leading female abolitionist, she equated them. They were like one and the same to her. And you may know Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. It was an Enlightenment tract, really the first feminist philosopher. That was an inspiration to Lucretia Mott. She kept it on her coffee table her whole life. And her house in Philadelphia was like a lighthouse for all the Unitarians and abolitionists who were coming and going between Washington and Boston. Even John Quincy Adams spent time there. So did Sojourner Truth. She was the first to have a mixed race salon. And she was truly the greatest woman in America before the Civil War. And the founder at Seneca Falls of the women's rights movement. You asked about her political, her political presence was her voice. Her persuasion was her voice. She had this beautiful musical voice that could fill a hall wherever she was, from Boston to Ohio to Virginia, and people of all persuasions, could come away convinced by her presence, which had sort of she often quoted from Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, on emancipation. And she moved a lot of minds, thousands of minds, multitudes of minds in her time, simply with her voice. Alice Paul looked up to her, although she was not a speaker herself. But I can tell you that if you put those two women in the same room, they would have a lot to talk about. And Alice Paul named the Equal Rights Amendment the Lucretia Mott Amendment.
So let's talk about that. What happened after the 1913 march? Wilson took office, and then?
Well, then there was a very long, hard struggle. There were protests outside his gates. He was, known as like a foreign policy visionary, but here at home, he unfortunately instituted segregation in the federal workforce, and he opposed women's suffrage. He once called a few of the women in to have a cup of tea to discuss it. And because he was a professor, I think he gave them a little lecture on states' rights, and they were not amused. So he was quite a proud man. He did not like to be challenged, especially by young ladies. And so it took him a very long time. It took 5 years until 1918 for him to see that he had to give ground. He had to surrender. And to his credit, Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and gave a speech urging passage of a suffrage amendment. And he also urged the state houses to do the same. It took a long time, but he did finally see that, especially with the coming of World War I, entering World War I, which was his signature in the second term, that women were part of the war mobilization, the effort. Women were being shipped overseas as nurses. Women could not be treated as second or third class citizens any longer.
So how did this play into the ultimate passage of the 19th Amendment?
Well, the House first passed it and then the Senate. And then, as you know, it has to go through state by state for ratification. 3/4 of the states have to ratify. So Alice Paul came up with another visual of, sewing stars on banners right outside the White House for every state that had ratified, and thereby putting the spotlight on those who had not. And in this phase of the movement, she did have help from the old guard, the Carey, Catman Shap old guard, who knew the states by states terrain better. But she had done the hard work. She had done the original work of getting the federal strategy, passed into an amendment to the Constitution.
So once that, continuing along the arc,
Okay.
what did the landscape look like for women's voting after the passage of the 19th Amendment?
In the 20s? Well, I wish I could tell you there was a great rush of women running for office like you, Lucy. You're part of the arc. There was a woman named Jeanette Rankin from Montana, who was the first woman to be elected to Congress, even before 1920. And she was the first, not only the first Congresswoman, but she voted against both world wars as a pacifist. There was a small coterie of women in the 20s who ran for Congress, but it didn't have the galvanizing effect that perhaps Alice Paul had hoped, wished would follow from her long campaign.
And you talked a bit about the synergies between abolition and the suffrage movement. How did the development of the civil rights movement serve to bolster the efforts that came after the passage of the 19th Amendment?
Okay, and you mean in the 60s and 70s?
Sure.
Okay, well, isn't it interesting that there is always a synergy, first between the abolitionists and the women's rights people, and then later in the 60s, how that gave way to the sisterhood of the feminist movements. Often the same exact people were in both movements, women and men. It's just that it took a while for one to blossom from another. And the gift that Lucretia Mott gave us is to equate them, to see them as not even as two halves of a whole, just as one.
And I think that it would be instructive to answer a question that Frank from the audience has about why were women denied the right to vote by the founders, since enfranchisement was actually part of colonial life. Can you speak to the cognitive dissonance in the early days of the Republic?
There was maybe one state that had votes for women. That was New Jersey, I think. So the women were not widely enfranchised in the colonies, but you have to just take it with a lump of salt. We were founded on white male privilege, often white male privilege that owned enslaved people, and they do not surrender that privilege, or they don't even share it very easily. They don't, wake up one day and say, "Oh, women can't vote. That's not fair." We fought a civil war. 700,000 people laid down their lives over slavery. We have a constant tension between those who were granted privilege by birthright, and those who are just trying to extend and expand those privileges. That's what Frederick Douglass did. That's what Lucretia Mott did. That's what Alice Paul did. They gave new meaning to we, the people. They expanded democracy.
And so since you talked a bit about the movement in England, can you talk a bit about how these issues, although universal in some way, can you talk about how they were also uniquely American?
I think slavery most obviously our tragic flaw. And you might be interested to know that mobs are nothing new in American history. The first mobs were always set on abolitionists. In fact, they almost burned down Lucretia Mott's house in Philadelphia. So pro-slavery mobs in the 1830s are the forerunner of the Ku Klux Klan, of white supremacists today. And we will always have that tragic tension until we can finally, once and for all, refuse to tolerate it in any way, shape, or form. And over the last 4 years, that strain in American society became emboldened.
So while we're talking about white supremacy, listeners may not have had a chance to read your beautiful piece of the week before last about your own experience in the Capitol during the siege. So I was hoping you could share a little bit about what happened then and how you see that being present for the counting of the votes, how you see that along this arc of voting rights questions in American history.
Mm-hmm. Well, the vote is the passport to democracy. I was in the House chamber in the press gallery as a journalist, witnessing the Electoral College certification. And we knew it was going to be a long day and a long night with challenges. We didn't know that we would hear a mob shrieking, running down the marble halls and breaking glass and banging on the door. And there are 2 entrances to the chamber. They were at both of them. We could even hear gunshots coming from one door, but not knowing that there were thousands of them out on the terrace, the veranda, the steps. We just knew they had breached the rotunda. They were close to breaching the House chamber. It was a matter of moments that we escaped to safety. And when I tell this, it comes back to me like the most it was the most volatile moment of trauma in my life. I thought it could be all over because remember in 2001, September 11th, the Capitol was a target of the 4th plane that went down. So who knew what the plan was? All we knew is that the mob had taken control of the building and the police had lost control. It was a siege. Never in my life did I expect to be in a siege. And now I know what it was like for, those brave early abolitionists and suffragists who had to have physical courage to do what they did.
And where do you see that on this arc? Are we bending towards justice?
I think this siege will create an awakening, Lucy, if it hasn't already. I think there's just been a very rude awakening that this is how far we've gone down the well of hate and violence. And we almost lost democracy that day. It was a very close call. So I think like Alice Paul, we have to invent a new game change. We can't just keep doing the same thing over and over. We have to have a new paradigm.
So someone in the audience has asked, I think rightly, what can we learn from the legacy of Paul, of Mott, of Wells Barnett, and others about strategic political efforts, and what could that look like today?
That's a very good question. My answer is visibility. I don't mean visibility on your Facebook page, on social media. What they learned and what they practiced was to be seen and heard out in the public sphere, and to have a very coherent and very unapologetic stance. You know, Alice Paul was going to be there as long as it took. You know, she wasn't there for a week or for a month. Ida Wells Barnett published her newspaper week after week. They did not give up. Even if they had a small circle, you know, of the fellow advocates, they were always expanding it. And they had faith in their message, and they had faith in the right of what they stood for. And they didn't just spend a lot of time in their living room or their couch on so-called social media. Alice Paul mobilized the media of her day to round up thousands, but I think we need more face-to-face. We need to build coalitions. We need to build trust with each other. The way that politics always has, face-to-face. The founders didn't write those documents, right, in 1787 on they didn't do that online. They did it in the same room for days and days. And do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I'm just sharing with the audience your terrific account in the BBC about your experience. And I think it's so important that you talk about the Quaker underpinnings of part of the suffrage movement and the importance of nonviolence. And so can you also kind of juxtapose what we have seen recently as vote suppression and far right advocacy and white supremacy as compared to how the arc of suffrage has manifested itself?
Yes, and armed mob violence or uniformed violence can be very hard to overcome, right? But in the end, Martin Luther King believed, Alice Paul believed, her ancestor William Penn, the great Quaker governor, believed in nonviolence, confrontation, and that it could be very creative. It could be very maddening to whoever you were protesting, but it's not for the faint of heart. Let me put it that way. The early Quakers were jailed by the English king. The reason William Penn went to Pennsylvania is because the king wanted to get rid of them. They were causing too much trouble. So take this land, call it Pennsylvania, and goodbye. So don't think of Quakers or Martin Luther King or all the people who have stood in the face of violence as sissies or goody-goodies. Far from it. They were braver than most of us, and they lived to tell the tale. I lived to tell the tale of the siege. It looked a little, it looked like anything could happen for a moment there, but it does make you stronger. It can make you determined that you cannot give in to the mob. And I would give credit to Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer that they all three agreed we have to come back and continue until 4 a.m. to finish what we came for.
I'm going to take moderator privilege to talk a little about the some modern manifestations of this. And we, of course, have seen voter suppression at a horrifying scale in recent years and leading up to the most recent election. But we also are in a moment where there is an incredible amount of attention and transparency around issues of voting. And Jamie, you probably know, but others may not, that the laws around felony disenfranchisement disallowing people who were accused of and convicted of a felony offense came within 2 years of the Civil War as really intentional efforts to strip newly enfranchised Black men of their right to vote. And of course, those persist until today. And I'm just going to share an article of mine in the Washington Post on the subject, because it really is worth noting how different the electoral landscape would look as a matter of racial justice if we were not stripping so many Americans of their right to vote, not just after they're incarcerated, but even while they're incarcerated. And in fact, the only 2 states in the country that allow people to vote from prison are the 2 whitest states in the country. And I think we can imagine that our policies, especially with respect to criminal justice, which is my area of expertise and interest, if people seeking to lead the system had to go and secure votes from their constituents who were behind bars. And I think we can also imagine how that might help address the scourge of mass incarceration that the country faces. So would love any thoughts you have on that subject.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's one more piece of the whole puzzle that we're talking about of keeping people out of democracy. And there's so many ways, and they've spent a lot of time on this, the people on the inside, keeping people on the outside out. And so it takes a tremendous amount of energy, determination, imagination, verve, time, money, to just change every little which way that the key is turned to unlock the whole structure.
Right. I'm glad to see that we're inspiring people in the audience to get motivated. Frank wants to know, is civil disobedience needed to end the Electoral College? Do you have thoughts on that?
All right, civil disobedience is not the same as nonviolent resistance. And Alice Paul was very clear on that. She was a lawyer too, she had a JD. And civil disobedience means that you knowingly, deliberately break the law. Okay. I'm all for nonviolent resistance, and if it comes to civil disobedience, so be it. But the Electoral College is not our friend, right? It's not inclusive. It was a very ingenious system dreamed up to keep the larger states and the cities. Not just the states, the cities like New York City, Lucy, like Los Angeles, we are very disempowered compared to the rural states that may have large territory but small population. Like Wyoming has 700,000 people, which is the same as my city of Washington, and we have no voice in the Senate. So yes, something has to be done about the Electoral College. We need a political genius to dismantle it. And I think that day is coming. What do you think, Lucy?
I'm with you. I think it is coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Frank what his plans are. Keep us in the loop. I'm going to invite folks to put other thoughts or questions into the chat before we conclude. And in the meantime, Jamie, I want to know if you could channel Alice Paul today, who in so many ways is the linchpin of this movement in the 20th century. And you could speak to the generations of women who have voted in their first election in November, this past November. What do you imagine Alice Paul would say to them?
Alice Paul, if I may speak for her, would be so very proud of this election, the turnout. In fact, she would say that those long lines in Georgia and so many states, all over the South and the West and everywhere, she would say those long lines in face of a pandemic were nonviolent resistance. It wasn't called that by the media, but that's what I saw when I witnessed those people were not going home until they voted. And that's exactly her determination. She was not going home until women won the vote. I might add she didn't just settle for one amendment to the Constitution. She was also the author of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. She spent the rest of her life strategizing, organizing, testifying before Congress, living here in Washington in a community of women in a beautiful townhouse. She spent her life night and day trying to get the ERA passed. So she was a political genius. She deserves to have statues. She deserves to be taught and known and celebrated. But she didn't do any self-promotion. That's why I'm doing it for her. And she would be very, very proud of the people of the United States, we the people who won a free and fair election for the future in 2020. Say, we're not going to stand for it anymore.
Let's see. So someone has asked where Paul's singular deep determination came from. Can you speak a little bit to that? I know we're jumping out of order a bit, but I want to try to hit folks' questions.
That's a great question. And there's not a lot, there is a big book published by Oxford University Press about her, but she's hard to know. She didn't write a lot. She didn't have an intimate relationship. She was all about social change. And I think she was that way as a very young girl and woman. When she was first jailed in her 20s, the first thing she did was she picked up an object and she threw it through the window to break the window, as if to say, you can't stop me from communicating with my friends on the outside. You know, she was always finding ways to stand up to the patriarchy, to the system, to the jailers, to the, you know, whoever was trying to get in her way. I will tell you one piece of nonviolent resistance that directly against President Wilson that has raised eyebrows even over decades of time, century of time. And that is that she had organized the bonfires. She burned some of his speeches and bonfires outside the White House because, you know, he was a great orator about liberty and about making the world safe for democracy. So she kind of turned his own words against him. They never had a denouement. There was never any love lost between them. But Wilson, to his credit, is a father of 4 daughters. He did come around to women's suffrage, and he did it with conviction in front of Congress. And that made all the difference.
Terrific. So I can see that there is a lot of interest in the audience in more conversation about the Electoral College. So Elizabeth and Sarah, I hope that if you haven't already, that there's something in the hopper for exploring that with the Woodrow Wilson community. And I think that I'll just, one off-topic question that someone has put to us that I'm gonna kick to Jamie is, do you think Trump will be impeached and convicted? And I am going to remain mum because I'm running for Manhattan District Attorney. And I think that the worst thing that could happen would be if anyone said anything on the campaign trail for that office that would suggest any kind of political motivation.
I just,
the investigation there. So your thoughts on impeachment?
I'm a Senate watcher, and the conventional wisdom right now is that, you know, he was impeached by the House the second time, but the Senate will not round up 17 votes to Republican votes to convict Trump. However, I think there's a good chance they will, because Mitch McConnell is not a leader of the mob. He's a leader, he loves the Senate. I know he was deeply mortified at what happened, infuriated. He has nothing left for Trump. So if he votes for conviction, then that would free up, you know, at least a dozen of his members to do the same. And we know that Mitt Romney was the only Republican vote for conviction before. So I think it's possible, just like I thought that Georgia would elect 2 Democratic senators, and I was right because of the nonviolent resistance we witnessed. And I think the Senate is going to go through a sea change of its own in the course of the trial and the course of public pressure, public sentiment. Alice Paul knew that public sentiment was everything. And Abraham Lincoln knew that public sentiment was everything. Public sentiment has to come out to play.
Well, I'm so pleased to see that Hallie in the audience tells us that her household toasted the inauguration using glasses from Seneca Falls. She says, we are all of us responsible and able activists to champion the future president of we the people. And as I turn it over to Elizabeth, I just wanted to really thank Jamie for her expertise, her wisdom, her courage, especially most recently. Encourage all of you to follow her writing and work. Please follow me on @LucyLangNYC. And I wanted to close with a quote from Ida Wells Barnett, who said, and I hope this is part of what we were doing here today, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them.
Ah, beautiful.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lucy Lang and Jamie Stiehm. Thank you so much. Really great talk. And thank you to the audience for your comments and questions. That's really engaging. And the discourse on civil disobedience is something we will definitely take note of at the Wilson House and consider for one of our future topics, because it definitely seems civil disobedience and a lot of these questions are really terrific. So that's something to come. I want to thank everyone in the audience. For those of you who made a donation online to support the Wilson House today and to participate in this call, thank you very, very much. We appreciate your participation and we appreciate your donation. Again, the Wilson House Speaker Series is brought to you through generous donations from supporters Carrie Fuller, Nancy Bliss, Ed Gerber, and Chris Keller. So I'd like to thank them as well for today. Next week, actually in 2 weeks, our talk will continue. We will have Dr. Shat Lane from Georgetown University talking about her book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, which will be moving to paperback soon. And so she will be joining us on February 9th. It's a Tuesday at noon. And then on February 23rd, again at noon, we have the editor at large of the 19th, who is going to be discussing Black women in American politics as voters, organizers, and candidates. That will be Erin Haynes, and she will join us on February 23rd. So tune in. I look forward to joining you then. Thanks very much and have a good and safe week. Thank you.